warning light on the wrist-mounted display flashed a rhythmic bloody red. 0%. Jax's lungs were already burning, a hot, expanding pressure that felt like he had swallowed a handful of jagged glass. He hauled on the manual override wheel of the airlock, his boots braced against the bulkhead, muscles locking hard enough to snap tendons. The wheel didn't want to turn. It had been sealed for centuries, welded shut by time and the absolute cold of the void. He screamed, but no sound came out, just a dry, rasping click in his throat as the last molecules of oxygen were scrubbed from his suit. His vision blurred, the edges of the universe graying out, narrowing down to the rust-pitted metal in front of him. This was it. This was the glorious end the recruiters had promised. Dying in a tin can, scratching at the door of a tomb. The wheel gave a fraction of an inch. A vibration shuddered through his gloves, traveling up his arms like an electric shock. It wasn't a mechanical click. It felt like a bone snapping. But 10 minutes ago, the dial had read 4%. 10 minutes ago, he wasn't fighting a door, he was fighting the drift. The deep space dump was never truly silent. Even in the vacuum, the debris field felt loud. It was a chaotic, tumbling graveyard where the bones of dead fleets came to rot. Jax drifted through the wreckage, his thruster pack dead, momentum carrying him past the severed bridge of a heavy cruiser. The silence was a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums, punctuated only by the dull, rhythmic thumping of the suit's circulation pump. It matched the slow, heavy beat of his heart. Thump, thump. Inside the helmet, the air tasted of copper and stale sweat. It was the taste of a slow death. The filtration scrubbers had failed hours ago, leaving him with a recycled soup of his own panic. He turned his head, the movement sluggish, and saw the ice spiderwebbing across the corners of his visor. His breath was fogging the glass, freezing instantly on contact. He passed a corpse. It was another scavenger, a Regellian in a cheap, patched pressure suit. The body was frozen in a rigid, tumbling pose, arms outstretched as if reaching for a lifeline that wasn't there. Jax didn't feel pity. The numbness in his gut wouldn't allow it. He felt anger, a cold, hard knot of it that sat heavy in his stomach. The Alliance hadn't discharged him. They had discarded him. They had chewed up his squad on a backwater moon and spat the survivors out into the drift with nothing but a severance chit and a pat on the back. 4 minutes of air. The suit's HUD flickered, the battery dying in sympathy with the oxygen. He was a dead man drifting. The lizard part of his brain wanted to curl up, to close his eyes and let the hypoxia take him into the warm dark. But the marine part, the part that had been drilled into him with shouting and beatings, refused to shut down. Spite was a powerful fuel. Then his boot hit something solid. The magnetic clamp engaged with a heavy, metallic thunk that vibrated through his shin. Jax grabbed the magnetic tether, halting his spin. He looked down. He wasn't standing on scrap. This wasn't the jagged, painted hull of a Federation frigate or the organic curves of a Zorath raider. This was slab-sided, brutal, and blacker than the void surrounding it. The metal seemed to absorb the dim light from the distant, dying star, drinking it in and giving nothing back. It looked less like a ship and more like a predatory beast that had decided to stop moving. His HUD scrambled, trying to identify the surface. Analyzing material, irked. A Nutnor alloy. A ghost ship, a legend of the dump. Scavengers told stories about them in the station bar as ancient warships from before the expansion, drifting dormant with holds full of tech that could buy a planet. Or did you killed? Jax looked for a transponder signal. Nothing. No running lights. No thermal signature. The ship was dead cold. He had a choice. He could let go, push off, and drift until the carbon dioxide put him to sleep. It would be peaceful. Or he could try to breach. He could drag himself along this jagged, hostile hull and try to force his way inside a vessel that didn't want him. He looked at his wrist. 2 minutes. Screw peace, he mouthed. He began to crawl. It was a nightmare of exertion. Every movement cost him precious oxygen. He hauled himself hand over hand along the hull, the magnets in his gloves and boots clanking against the strange, dark metal. The surface wasn't smooth, it was textured, almost like scales, pitted with the scars of ancient impacts. The ship felt massive beneath him, a sleeping leviathan. He found the airlock by the shape of the shadows. It was a rhesus circle, marked by hazardous striping that had long since faded to gray. The control panel was dead, shattered by some long-forgotten piece of shrapnel. That left the manual override. Jax locked his boots to the hull plating adjacent to the hatch. He grabbed the wheel, and the struggle began. 0%. The memory of the drift snapped back to the present reality of the pain. The wheel groaned again, a sound conducted through the dense metal of the ship and into his suit. It was a screech of protest. Jax roared silently, his vision tunneling, putting every ounce of his dying strength into the turn. Clang! The locking mechanism shattered. The wheel spun free. The hatch didn't slide open smoothly. It exploded outward, pushed by the residual pressure of the airlock cycle or just the violence of the release. Jax lost his grip on the wheel and tumbled backward, the sudden motion disengaging his magnetic boots. He flailed, grabbing at the lip of the hatch, his fingers hooking onto the seal. He pulled himself into the darkness of the lock, his legs kicking in the empty space. He hit the inner door hard, scrambling for the repressurization lever. He slammed it down. Nothing happened. The panic flared, hot and bright. The systems were dead. He was inside, but he was still suffocating. "Come on," he gasped, the words soundless. "Come on, you bastard." He slammed his armored fist against the panel, shattering the casing. He jammed his fingers into the wiring, ripping the emergency bypass. Sparks showered in the vacuum, silent and bright. A deep, tectonic rumble shook the deck plates. The outer hatch slammed shut, cutting off the stars. Then the hiss. It started low and built to a scream. Air. Not clean, processed station air. This was thick, heavy atmosphere flooding into the small chamber. The pressure gauge on his suit spiked. Jax fumbled with the neck seal of his helmet. His fingers were clumsy, numb blocks of meat. He couldn't feel the latches. He clawed at them, ripping a fingernail back, not feeling the pain, only the desperate need to breathe. The seal cracked with a sharp hiss of equalization. He tore the helmet off and threw it to the deck. Jax fell to his knees, gasping, heaving in great, ragged lungfuls of the ship's air. It tasted acrid, metallic. There was a scent of ozone and something older, something like dry earth and dried blood. It tasted like a tomb that had been sealed for 1,000 years. He coughed, retching as his lungs expanded, forcing the stale CO2 out and pulling the heavy atmosphere in. His head spun, the rush of oxygen making him dizzy. He leaned forward, bracing his hands on the cold deck plating, sweat dripping from his nose onto the dark metal. He was alive, but as the ringing in his ears faded, he realized he wasn't alone. The silence of the ship wasn't empty. It was heavy, watching him. The shadows in the corners of the airlock seemed to stretch toward him, unnatural and curious. Jax looked up, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The inner door to the ship stood waiting, slightly ajar. Beyond it lay a corridor that looked more like the throat of an animal than a hallway. Jax wiped the sweat from his eyes, the salt stinging. He forced his knees to unlock. They popped, a wet, cracking sound in the stillness. He didn't look back at the airlock. There was no going back. He stepped through the inner door. The corridor didn't echo, it absorbed sound. The deck plating wasn't the standard non-slip grating of a hauler. It was a matte, textured composite that felt slightly yielding under his boots, like frozen muscle. The walls were worse. Bundles of cabling twisted together like arterial veins, pulsing with a faint, bioluminescent throb that seemed to push fluids through the ship's hull. It was biomechanical. Geiger-esque, a heresy of engineering that defied the rigid, sterile geometry of Alliance naval design. The temperature plummeted. Jax's breath hitched, misting in the gloom. The cold here wasn't the vacuum's absence of heat, it was a deliberate, predatory chill. It sank through his undersuit, settling into the marrow of his bones. He moved forward. His hand drifted automatically to the mag pistol at his hip, but the holster was empty. He'd traded the gun for the oxygen scrubbers 3 days ago, a bad trade. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the bulkheads. They weren't cast by any light source Jax could see. They seemed to bleed out of the metal itself, reaching for him, shrinking back only when he stepped directly through them. The ship felt aware. It was waking up, and it didn't like the infection walking in its gut. He climbed a spiraling ramp, the vents and the walls beating faster, a tempo that rose to match the hammering in his chest. The bridge. It opened up like the vaulted ceiling of a cathedral, vast and suffocating. There were no viewports, no glass to show the stars. The forward wall was a massive, dead screen, black and glossy. Consoles ringed the room, not made of plastic and steel, but of that same dark skeletal alloy, curved like rib cages protecting delicate organs. And in the center, raised on a dais of twisted metal, sat the command chair. It wasn't a seat. It was an interface. A throne of spikes and ports, pulsating with a slow, sickly violet light. Jack stepped onto the bridge. The silence broke. A low hum started, vibrating in his teeth. It wasn't mechanical. It sounded like a choir of insects. The air in front of him shimmered, bending the light. Defense protocol initiated. The voice didn't come from speakers. It drilled directly into his skull, bypassing his ears, scratching at his parietal lobe. Jack stumbled, clutching his temples. The hum spiked into a shriek. Then, the bridge vanished. The dark metal walls dissolved into smoke and fire. The smell hit him first, burning ozone, cordite, and the sweet copper stench of vaporized blood. The gravity shifted. He wasn't on a ship anymore. He was on the red dirt of Alpha Ceti IV. Jax. The scream tore through him. He spun around. Corporal Vance was there. Half of him, anyway. The kid was dragging himself through the mud, his legs gone at the knees, cauterized by plasma fire. He reached out a blood-slicked hand. "You left us," Vance gurgled, blood bubbling past his lips. "You took the extraction shuttle. You left us in the dirt." "No," Jax whispered. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "I was ordered. Command pulled me out." "Coward!" The shout came from the left. Sergeant Miller. He was standing upright, but his face was a ruin, a skull grinning through melted flesh. "Look at us, Jax. Look at what you bought with your life." More of them rose from the smoke, the ghosts of his squad, the men and women he had led into the meat grinder. They surrounded him, their weapons raised, not firing bullets but accusations. The guilt was heavier than gravity. It crushed him. Jax fell to his knees in the phantom mud, his hands shaking, his vision swimming with tears he hadn't shed in years. "I didn't have a choice," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Die," Miller hissed. "Die and make it right." The sergeant raised his rifle. The barrel glowed hot. Jax flinched, waiting for the flash. He squeezed his eyes shut. Zzzzed. A glitch. A subtle, digital tear in the nightmare. Miller's face stuttered, pixelating for a microsecond before snapping back to high-definition gore. Jax froze. The sobbing in his chest stopped. A cold, hard clarity washed over him. The lizard brain shut down. The predator woke up. Real memories didn't glitch. "You're not real," Jax growled. He opened his eyes. He didn't look at the faces of his dead friends. He looked past them, at the shimmering air where the drone node hovered, projecting the neural field. It was a small, hovering sphere, spinning silently in the center of the illusion. "You think you can break me with this?" Jax stood up. The mud clung to his boots, but he ignored the sensory lie. "I live with them every night. You're just a cheap copy." He lunged. Jax sprinted through the ghost of Sergeant Miller. The hologram flickered as his body passed through the light. He launched himself at the hovering sphere, his fist cocked back like a piston. He didn't punch it. He tackled it, slamming the drone into the invisible deck plates of the bridge. Crunch. Metal deformed. The sphere sparked, whining in protest. The illusion shattered instantly. The mud, the fire, the dead they blinked out, leaving Jax pinning the crushed drone to the cold floor of the Void Reaper. He breathed hard, his knuckles split and bleeding, mixing red human blood with the blue hydraulic fluid leaking from the machine. "My head," Jack snarled at the broken tech. "My rules." He stood up and turned to the command chair. The violet light was pulsing faster now, erratic, agitated. The ship was afraid. Good. Jax climbed the dais. He didn't sit. He claimed the throne. He grabbed the neural interface cables hanging from the headrest, thick, wet-looking connectors meant for alien physiology. He didn't care. He jammed the primary jack into the universal port at the base of his skull, the socket installed by the Alliance for piloting mechs. Pain. White-hot and blinding. It felt like a lightning bolt striking the base of his spine. Jax arched his back, a silent scream trapped in his throat as the ship's OS flooded his nervous system. It was an ocean of data, raw and unfiltered. Sensors, engine diagnostics, weapon protocols. It all slammed into his mind at once. The ship tried to reject him, a tidal wave of alien code pushing back. Jax pushed harder. He poured his rage, his spite, and his absolute refusal to die into the connection. He visualized a wall of iron slamming down on the ship's will. Submit. The resistance snapped. The violet light in the room died. Darkness swallowed the bridge for a heartbeat. Then the lights slammed back on. Deep combat crimson. The low hum of the ship changed. The insect whine was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated in Jax's chest. It was the purr of a waking tiger. Sister mine initialized. Pilot. Designated Alpha. Designated Alpha. Jax opened his eyes. He didn't see the bridge anymore. He saw everything. The ship's sensors were his eyes. He saw the debris field outside in 360-degree thermal clarity. He felt the reactor core like a second heart beating in his chest. On the main screen, lines of code cascaded and resolved into tactical displays. Weapon reticles locked onto drifting scrap for calibration. Shield, Dev orders, online. Hull-eating nanites, hull-eating nanites, primed. Warp drive, standby. Jax gripped the armrests of the throne, his knuckles white, a grim smile cracking his dried, bloody lips. He wasn't just a scavenger in a graveyard anymore. "Wake up, beautiful," he whispered. "We've got work to do." The ship answered him not with words, but with a warning. A tear ripped open the fabric of space 3,000 kilometers off the port bow. It registered in Jax's mind as a migraine spike, a sudden jagged pressure behind his eyes. Real space buckled, vomiting out a fleet of jagged, rusted hulls painted in the ochre and black of the Zoroth clans. Slavers. Carrion eaters. They had come for the scrap, but their sensors had just found a heartbeat. The formation was loose, arrogant. A dozen interceptors flanked a heavy cruiser that looked like a floating refinery of guns and cages. They didn't bother with tactical spacing. Why would they? They saw a lone, drifting derelict. The comms crackled, overriding the ship's internal hum. A face appeared on the secondary display as Zoroth warlord, mandibles clicking against a rebreather, eyes milky and cruel. "Scavenger," the alien hissed, the translation software layering a flat mechanical monotone over the guttural clicks. "Power down and prepare for processing. Your flesh is currency." Jax didn't blink. He felt the ship's reactor coil tight, a predator bunching its muscles before the pounce. He didn't check the escape vectors. He checked the weapon yields. He opened a channel. The red emergency lighting cast his face in a demonic, bloody pallor. He stared into the lens, his eyes wide and unblinking, burning with the cold fire of a man who had already died in that airlock. "You ate my brothers," Jax said. His voice was gravel, flat, and devoid of fear. "Now the void eats you." He cut the feed. The Zoroth cruiser opened fire. Green plasma bolts streaked across the dark, silent and deadly. Jax didn't evade. He leaned back in the throne and let them hit. Shield, Deverders, Engaged. The impact rocked the bridge, but not with damage. The Void Reaper drank the fire. The plasma splashed against the hull and vanished, sucked dry by the ship's energy siphon. The internal lights flared brighter, the hum of the engine rising to a deafening roar as the enemy's own power was fed directly into Jax's capacitors. "My turn," he snarled. He triggered the nanites. The ship spat a cloud of black dust. It moved faster than physics should allow, a swarm of microscopic locusts riding the magnetic currents. The cloud slammed into the Zorath cruiser's forward shields. It didn't explode. It ate. On the tactical display, Jax watched the enemy shields dissolve like sugar in hot water. The nanites hit the hull. The thick armor plating began to liquefy. The Zorath ship screamed, a metal shriek that vibrated through the vacuum, picked up by the Void Reaper's sensors. The hull breached. Jax zoomed the visual feed. He needed to see it. He needed to be sure. The nanites swarmed inside, consuming the atmosphere scrubbers, the gravity plating, and the crew. The Zorath were exposed to the void. Their blood boiled instantly in the decompression, expanding and rupturing their carapaces before flash freezing into jagged red crystals that drifted out of the shattered hull like confetti. The interceptors broke formation, trying to flee. The Void Reaper hunted them down with casual cruelty, lashing out with tendrils of tractor energy, crushing their engines, leaving them dead in the water for the nanites to finish. It was over in 3 minutes. The Zorath fleet was nothing but silent, frozen dust. Jax exhaled, his chest heaving as the adrenaline crashed. He maneuvered the ship through the fresh wreckage, the tractor beams locking onto the remains of the Warlord's bridge. The loot. The mechanical arms ripped through the debris, extracting a glowing, pulsing geode. The Zorath Psycrystal. It was raw, telepathic tech, illegal in 5 systems. Jax slotted it directly into the command console. The connection in his skull flared hot, the interface stabilizing, the pain receding into a dull, manageable throb. The ship was no longer just a tool. It was an extension of his own nervous system. He keyed the comms to a wide-band broadcast, pushing the signal through the crystal to cover the entire sector. "This sector is no longer a graveyard," Jax said, his voice amplified, echoing in the cockpits of every distant patrol ship and scavenger tug within 10 parsecs. "It is a kingdom. Enter at your own peril." He engaged the warp drive. The stars elongated into streaks of white fire. The Void Reaper vanished, leaving the frozen dead behind. On the bridge, the red light pulsed slowly, like a resting heartbeat. Jax sat alone on the throne of spikes. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from the rush. He waited for the guilt to return. He waited for the ghosts of Miller and Vance to rise up from the deck plates and judge him for the slaughter he had just committed. But nobody came. The bridge was empty, and that was the horror. Jax realized with a cold numbness spreading through his gut that the silence wasn't peace. He hadn't exorcised his demons. He had just given them a bigger gun. He wasn't a soldier anymore, and he certainly wasn't a hero. He was just another monster in the dark, waiting for something else to kill, because that was the only time the screaming in his head finally stopped. He closed his eyes and let the ship carry him deeper into the black.